وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. Alright. We stopped on making dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in sincerity. أن تدعوا الله, we said the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم بحديثه قال ادعوا الله وأنتم موقنون بالإجابة واعلموا أن الله لا يقبل دعاء من قلب غافل ولاهٍ. So we said, when you make dua with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in sincerity, knowing fulfillingly that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will answer the dua, you have no doubt whatsoever in the dua that you asked for. And remember that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not accept the dua from those whose hearts are astray and away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Alright? And this is one of the cures that are required. فهذا دواء نافع مزيل للداء ولكن غفلة القلب عن الله تبطل قوته. So this is one of the most important cure for the disease. But the weakness in someone's heart and faith with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it's like a blockade that makes your dua hard to be reached Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or acceptable with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, فضل الدعاء من أنفع الأدوية. Supplication is the most beneficial remedies. والدعاء من أنفع الأدوية وهو عدو البلاء يدفعه ويعالجه ويمنع نزوله ويرفعه أو يخففه إذا نزل وهو سلاح للمؤمن كما روى الحاكم في صحيحه من حديث النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم عن علي بن أبي طالب رواه علي بن طالب رضي الله عنه قال النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم الدعاء سلاح المؤمن وعماد الدين ونور السماوات والأرض. So supplication is one of the most beneficial remedies. It is the enemy of affliction. It fends off and it treats it. It obstructs its befalling and uplifts it if it descends. It is a weapon of the believer. As Al-Hakim has collected in the Sahih and authority of Ali ibn Abi Talib, who said, the Prophet ﷺ said, supplication is the weapon of the believer and the pillar of the religion and the light of the heavens and the earth. Now, this hadith, authentication level of it is weak. And from Aisha radiallahu anha, just to clarify that. And we'll explain why the Imam Qayyim rahimahullah ta'ala he used it. فقال رحمة الله عليه فصل والدعاء من أنفع الأدوية. He's just to make sure that dua, and he wants to emphasize that is one of the most powerful cure for any disease. So من أنفع الأدوية لكل داء ولكل بلاء فهو نافع في كل داء وفي كل بلاء ولهذا ينبغي على المسلم أن تعظم عنايته بالدعاء في كل باب من أبواب البلاء الذي يعاني منه. So it is from the importance for every believer and the duty for every believer that when it comes to anything that they are afflicted with, whether if it's harm for their body, for their mind, or their hearts, dua is the best supplication. Now, sincerity of the dua will be broken down into 3 levels. The stronger the calamity, dua repels it. And 2, the weaker the calamity, and so the calamity overpowers it, and the servant is afflicted. However, the supplication can lessen the effect of the calamity. Number 3, the combat with each other, canceling each other. So dua, it combats the what? The affliction. So as we said, whenever a person is making dua, يجب على الدعاء أن يكون أقوى من البلاء. Dua has to be much more powerful than the calamity. So when anything befalls you, no matter how big it is and how much it strikes you, the dua has to be much more powerful. If someone has to stay making dua day and night, hours upon hours, come sit here. The dua has to be powerful. Or else Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, like in the hadith al-Hakim, he reports in the authority of Aisha radiallahu anha, she said, the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said, caution cannot evade the decree from the occurring of the supplication. And she says, the occurring of the supplication when it has descended, and that which has not, indeed the calamity may befall, and he is met by a supplication causing them to both struggle against one another until the day of resurrection. Meaning, when someone tries to push something away with a dua, but they're struggling to make their dua in sincerity, they're going to continue in that struggle until the day of judgment. So as we said yesterday, when you expect something from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in sincerity, the reason behind it wouldn't be accepted. It's because of what? We said because of unlawful acts. Whenever someone says, well, my dua is sincere, and it's fulfilling me towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but it's not being accepted. Why? Before you question the dua, question the root behind yourself and how it all started. Question, how is your connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? How do you engage in certain unlawful acts? I mean, one of the biggest things that leads people to atheism is that they're like, I made dua and Allah's not there. Where is He? But then they forget, what have they done the night before, or the day before, or the months before, years before? How were your actions? Were you close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? يعني Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the hadith Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said, سَبْعَةٌ يُظِلُّهُمُ اللَّهُ تَحْتَ ظِلِّهِ يَوْمَ لَا ظِلَّ إِلَّا ظِلُّهُ. Amongst the seven, whom under the shade of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, where there's no shade but His, He can give you many explanations. And the ulama took this hadith and mufassirin that this hadith applies to jihad al-nafs, to the battle of the self. When it says imamun adil, first one is a righteous leader. All right? And many of the other ones, قَلْبُهُ مُتَعَلَّقٌ بِالْمَسَاجِد, a person whose heart is connected to the masajid. Or a person, دعته امرأة ذات جمال ومنصب قال إني أخاف الله, a woman with status and beauty, and she basically, when we say دعت, as invited him, basically called out to him. He said, no, إني أخاف الله رب العالمين. Yusuf alayhi salam, he himself almost fell to this bala. He was almost put into this trial. وراودته التي هو في بيتها عن نفسه, the one who he was raised by in her house, she tried to push herself over him. قال إيه؟ قال إني أخاف الله. He said, I fear Allah. Then what did he do? قال رب السجن أحب إلي مما تدعونني إليه. So his action that he did was what? He called to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in sincerity, and the power of the dua that he chose staying in prison over living outside of prison and falling into this sin. He said, oh Allah, being in prison is far more greater to me than falling into the sin, into this act. So the dua was, the supplication towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was sincere. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said it in the next ayah, proving his sincerity towards the dua. So then he was tossed in prison, he was thrown in prison. So it was reported by Al-Hakim أيضا that he said, from the authority of Umar, who narrated on the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said, supplication benefits in that which has descended and that which has not. And that is imperative, and it's imperative upon you. And he said, O servant of Allah, to supplicate is important. And we understand that dua is what? Dua is also part of ibadah. Dua huwa al-ibadah, كما قال النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم. Supplication is an act of worship in itself. And it's very important for a believer to know when they are making dua that they have no doubt in the question that the dua they're asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If you have a dharrat shak when making a dua, an atom of doubt when making dua, just know the dua will be cancelled. Because then when you have a doubt, who are you doubting? You're not doubting the dua, you're doubting the answer from Allah. So then when it comes to doubting the answer from Allah, you will start questioning Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That will cause a phasing in a person's heart. So a dua has to be very sincere towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then the authority of Thawban, he said, decree is not repelled by anything other than a supplication. None other than righteousness can increase lifespan and certainty. A man can be denied some provisions due to a sin they perpetrate. Again, back to what we said. When the Prophet ﷺ, when he said in Ibn al-Qayyim last night, what we came across when a man comes who has nothing and then calls to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, يقول يا رب يا رب. But then he forgets that أكله حرام وشرابه حرام. His food is haram, and his drinking is haram, and his dressing is haram. And then their supplication has no value. There's no base behind the supplication. There's no base behind the dua. But if you want the dua to be answered, reflect upon yourself first. See where you stand with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then Ibn al-Qayyim rahimahullah speaks about the persistence of dua. When we say consistency, is very important. Nobody does dua for a day or two and say, I'm done. Khalas, I did my part. No. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, every moment of his life, he had a chance, he would call to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so did the companions, radwanullahi alayhim. Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anhu. He would make sure to spend nights upon nights making dua towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Then, people asking, Ya Amir al-Mu'mineen, you are amongst the people who are giving glad tidings to enter Jannah. Why are you spending your time making dua and spending nights praying to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? His response is his persistence with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, fearing of any doubt in his heart, of him falling into a sin. Making sure that he is persistent when it comes to supplication towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That was the act of ibadah with the companions. That was the act that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam taught the companions. Persistency. So he said, amongst the most useful remedies, قال ابن القيم, is persistence in supplication. فروى ابن ماجه في سننه عن أبي هريرة رضي الله عنه أنه قال النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم, he said, whoever does not ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, من لا يسأل الله أو من لا يدعو الله سبحانه وتعالى, يغضب الله عنه, Allah becomes angry with them. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he said in the Quran, وَإِذَا سَأَلَكَ عِبَادِي وَقَالَ رَبُّكُمُ ادْعُونِي أَسْتَجِبْ لَكُمْ. He said, call out to me, I will answer you. Then the following ayah said what? إِنَّ الَّذِينَ يَسْتَكْبِرُونَ عَنْ عِبَادَتِي. Those who are too arrogant to call out to me and to worship me. He said what? إِنَّ الَّذِينَ يَسْتَكْبِرُونَ عَنْ عِبَادَتِي. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala promised them hellfire. He's angry with those who think they are much more pride. Their pride gets the best of them and their arrogance gets the best of them. So the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in this narration, he said, whomever does not call out to Allah, Allah gets angry with them. Now, Ibn al-Qayyim rahimahullah ta'ala, the reason why he brought this up to the questioner and the purpose behind it was to tell the questioner that no matter what, when he asked the question, he said that I've tried everything that I can, it shows what? Linguistically, it shows that he had given up. And he had lost hope, and he has doubts. So he had told him, this kind of act of not calling out to Allah in itself angers Allah. So the reason behind what might have not answered your dua, what might have not made Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala answer your calls, was because the doubt that you had and the inconsistency that you did not have with making dua. So he was telling them persistency is important. Being persistent about what you want with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is important. And this is why they said, يَجِبُ عَنِ الدُّعَاءِ أَن يَكُونَ أَقْوَى مِنَ الْبَلَاءِ. The dua has to be much more powerful than the calamity that had afflicted you. That's a must, that's a need. So this was his message. So we have to understand, all of this that we are taking from this book is still an answer to the question. So he wants to make sure that every part is left uncovered. From the spiritual side, and then from the personal side of a person. Ibn al-Qayyim, he tells the person, إِنَّ اللَّهَ يُحِبُّ. He said, indeed Allah loves those who are persistent in supplication. إِنَّ اللَّهَ يُحِبُّ الْعَبْدَ إِذَا أَصَرَّ فِي الدُّعَاء. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves when a servant does what? Is persistent. It's part of when the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when he said in the hadith, يُحِبُّ اللَّهُ عَبْدَهُ إِذَا أَخْطَأَ. Allah loves when a servant falls into a sin. Not because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants you to sin. No, no, no. It's because the act that comes after falling into a sin. And that is what? When you come to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in humility, when you return to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, knowing that He has the might and power over you and the control over everything. That in itself, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves. And when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves something, and He loves the act that His servant does, He loves the servant. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves a servant, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will answer for him. You have to build that connection with Allah. You cannot ask for something and there is no clear connection. It doesn't just come like that however you want. It's not a hit or miss with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's a direct thing given to you when you want anything in life. Let's say people who want to be successful in their businesses or whatever, and they have their bosses. What do? You try to, connect with your bosses. You try to get closer to them. You try to, build, something with them. And then when you do so, you get closer. They get closer to you. You guys become really, really bonded together. Then they elevate you and promote you. Similar thing with the servant with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You have to build those ties with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and build that connection. So this was the purpose behind Ibn al-Qayyim rahimahullah ta'ala of telling the believers and the person who asked this question, one of the reasons that might have not been answered is because you had doubt. And if you had doubt, that in its own self could be one of the biggest flaws that you have. Because from the question, he is breaking down the question for him. His own question when he said, I've tried everything that I can, and there is nothing possible that anyone can do or I can do to help me from this. It is an addiction. And we understand at the end of the book that it's what? It's the haram love that he had fallen to. That had taken him away from everything. And when somebody is under that clutch, they fall into a dawama, into a circle of calamity behind one another. And Allah, my dear brothers and sisters, anything that is haram, but it becomes very emotional and personal, it can cause a person to go astray, and it's an addiction. It's a big issue in this world, in this society today. A lot of young men and young women, they fall in love in schools, and that's what they make themselves believe that it's love. It's not really love. It's attachment to something that they did not have, that they wish to continue in, but they don't know what danger that comes from behind it. It's not really love. No one really understands what it means to actually fall in love. All these kids who think they know about this kind of stuff are ridiculous. But it's what has been designed for them in the society to make them fall and hang on it. Which is why it's very important, and I advise for every family member to teach and to have this book, Ad-Da' wa Dawa, as something that you raise your children based upon. It's very important. And especially for those parents who do not know how to manage your children. This could be a good lesson for the parents to start with. And everyone should live their lives, not just children. Everyone should, because adults are falling into it now. Now, especially in the adult industry, we've seen what happened with a lot of people with the whole addiction of the adult, films and all that stuff. It's dangerous. A lot of high schoolers, and there was a lot of Muslim people are actually falling into it. A lot of them came to me and said, Sheikh, Imam, I can't stop. I've tried to stop, and I stopped for like a month or two, and yeah. It's a danger that most people don't notice. And a lot of them said, inshallah, like when I get married, I can get rid of it. No. It's not possible. It's like somebody's on some drugs and thinking, I know when I go something or give themselves an excuse I will stop doing it. Inshallah, when I pray, and I'll stop doing it. Or when I leave this place, I'm gonna stop doing it. No. An addiction is an addiction. It doesn't matter what do you do and how do you try to get out of it. And from excuses you're trying to give yourself, you have to fight that battle with yourself. And it first starts with a dua. Dua is one of the most important things. And the reason behind that also, from the psychological part, when a person is making dua consistently, remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they themselves are going to hold themselves back. Just like Ramadan. Why does people stop? Everybody's halal in Ramadan. Because Ramadan is a shahr of ibadah. They're like, you know what? Like people, like I gave you an example on Instagram. They delete their, what are those things? Their highlights on Instagram and be like, it's Ramadan, I have to keep it halal. And then after Ramadan, they put it back up. A lot of people do it. A lot of people do it. But that's their mindset. So that's why the beauty of it, when somebody's continuous and consistent and persistent in their dua and dhikr, that's going to be where they stop. It's the line that they draw for themselves. Because they're like, you know, I'm going to make dhikr, I'm going to make dua. So then that fear makes them hold themselves back. It's important. So ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us the strength and to keep being persistent and making dua towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to guide us and make us amongst those who are guided. I'm going to stop it here for now, and we'll continue tonight, inshallah. Bi'inna ta'ala. It might be a little longer tonight. Actually, it is a little longer tonight. Jazakumullah.